The forest does not ask permission before it takes a life. It simply decides what stays and what disappears. And on a cold morning deep in the coastal woods of Oregon, that silence was heavier than the rain itself as it fell through towering Douglas firs and soaked into the ground like the earth was trying to forget something it had just witnessed. Somewhere between the broken light and the shifting fog, a small German shepherd puppy lay half-hidden beneath wet brush, its body trembling in shallow, uneven breaths that seemed too fragile to belong to something still fighting to exist. Every exhale was thinner than the last, carried away by the wind before it could mean anything, as if the world itself was unsure whether to keep listening. A few yards away, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of alert breathing, stood a military K-9 named Ranger, his coat darkened by rain, his posture rigid in a way that made him look carved out of discipline rather than flesh and bone. He did not approach yet, not because he was uncertain, but because something in him understood that the smallest movement might change what little chance remained. His amber eyes stayed locked on the fragile shape ahead, tracking every faint twitch, every pause in the puppy's struggle, as though he were counting the seconds left in a language no one had taught him. The rain softened for a moment, and in that brief quiet, the forest seemed to lean in closer, waiting. Ranger took one slow step forward, then another, his paws pressing into the soaked earth without sound, until he was close enough to lower his head and exhale softly, a breath that stirred the wet fur of the puppy but did not frighten it away. It was not aggression that held him in place, nor hesitation, but something deeper, a recognition that felt older than training, older than command, as if he had been here before in another life where the stakes were the same. Behind him, footsteps approached through the undergrowth, steady and controlled, the kind that did not rush even when the world demanded urgency. Sergeant Ethan Miller emerged from the mist with the quiet precision of a man who had learned long ago that panic never saves anyone, his uniform damp at the edges, his gaze scanning before it settled on what Ranger had already found. For a moment, he did not speak, because some sights do not allow words to form immediately. They demand silence first. The puppy's condition was clear even from a distance, not in dramatic detail, but in the way the body simply refused to hold itself together against the cold, the way life seemed to flicker instead of flow. Ethan lowered himself slowly, one knee touching the wet ground, his hand hovering near the earth as if asking permission from something unseen, and only then did he notice Ranger's position, not guarding against danger, but guarding the space around the puppy as though it were sacred. "Easy," Ethan murmured, though it was unclear whether he was speaking to the dog, the animal in distress, or the moment itself. Ranger did not look away. Instead, he shifted slightly, opening a narrow path between himself and the puppy, as if allowing Ethan into a space that had already been claimed by instinct. The wind moved through the trees again, bending branches overhead, scattering droplets that struck the ground like distant signals, and for a brief instant, everything felt suspended between decision and consequence. Ethan reached forward slowly, his fingers brushing the soaked fur with caution, feeling the faint, uneven warmth beneath it, a signal so small it almost did not exist. Ranger leaned in closer at the same time, not interfering, but anchoring the moment, as though he understood that whatever happened next would define more than survival. The forest around them remained indifferent, but within that small circle of earth and breath, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the weight of the silence. Ethan looked once at Ranger, and in that glance there was no command exchanged, only understanding, the kind that does not need words because it has already been earned somewhere far beyond this moment, in places where trust is not given but forged. The puppy's chest rose again, weaker than before, and held for a fraction longer than expected, as if the presence around it had become a reason not to let go just yet. And in that fragile persistence, something unspoken settled over the clearing. Not hope yet, not safety, but the first sign that neither the forest nor the storm would decide this ending alone. The forest held its breath in the way only remote places can, as if it understood that something fragile had already crossed a line between fading and staying, and every sound that followed now mattered more than it should have. The rain had softened into a fine mist, drifting between the trees like scattered ash, and the ground beneath them carried the weight of countless storms that had come before without ever remembering the names of those who stood within them. Sergeant Ethan Miller remained kneeling in the wet soil, his hand still hovering near the small body that refused to surrender completely, while Ranger stood beside him with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial, as if guarding not just life, but the idea that life could still be protected at all. For a long moment, neither man nor animal moved with urgency, because urgency often breaks what careful intention is trying to save. Ethan finally lowered his hand fully, feeling the faint tremor beneath the puppy's fur, a rhythm so inconsistent it almost disappeared between heartbeats, yet stubborn enough to suggest that something inside had not yet decided to leave. Ranger shifted slightly closer, his body angled in a way that blocked the wind from reaching the fragile form, not out of command, but out of instinct that had no training manual behind it. Ethan exhaled slowly, scanning the forest edge once more, not for danger, but for understanding, as if the trees themselves might explain how something so small had ended up here alone. "Stay with me," he said quietly, not as an order, but as a presence offered into the cold air. The puppy did not respond in any way that could be called certain, but there was a faint movement, barely noticeable, as if the sound itself had reached somewhere deeper than the body could express. Ranger lowered his head and gave a soft, controlled breath near the puppy, then looked toward Ethan, waiting without expectation, only readiness. Ethan reached for the small radio clipped to his vest, hesitated, and then decided against it, as if calling for help too soon might break the fragile balance already forming between breath and silence. Instead, he carefully slid his hands beneath the puppy, lifting it just enough to feel how little weight there was, how close everything felt to slipping away, and yet how stubbornly it still clung to warmth. Ranger stepped aside immediately, creating space, then followed closely as Ethan moved a few feet toward a fallen log where the ground was slightly less saturated. The puppy was placed there gently, and for a moment, all three remained still, surrounded by the sound of distant water dripping from leaves and the slow shifting of wind through branches. Ethan removed his jacket and wrapped it carefully around the small body, pressing it inward just enough to preserve heat without causing distress. His movements precise but careful, shaped by experience that had nothing to do with animals and everything to do with survival under pressure. Ranger remained standing, eyes fixed, ears forward, as if listening for something beyond what human senses could detect. Time seemed to slow further, stretching the moment into something that no longer felt like an ordinary rescue, but more like a quiet negotiation between loss and continuation. Ethan leaned closer, watching the subtle rise of the puppy's chest, counting silently, noticing that while the pattern remained weak, it was no longer disappearing as quickly as before. That change was small, almost insignificant in any other context, but here it carried weight, because in places like this, survival is never declared loudly, it is noticed in fragments. Ranger finally lowered himself to a seated position, not relaxed, but settled, as if accepting that the situation had entered a different phase, one where vigilance could be steady instead of urgent. Ethan glanced at him again, and this time there was something unspoken in his expression, not relief, not certainty, but recognition that the world sometimes places responsibility in the hands of those who did not ask for it. The forest around them continued its indifferent rhythm, rain fading in and out like distant memory. Yet within the small circle of damp earth and shared attention, something unfamiliar began to form, not resolution, not safety, but a fragile alignment between three lives that had intersected without warning, each holding the others in place just long enough for the next breath to matter. The air inside the forest had begun to shift in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, as if the storm that had dominated the morning was slowly surrendering its grip on the land, leaving behind a quieter tension that lingered in the damp soil and the trembling branches overhead. Sergeant Ethan Miller remained crouched beside the fallen log, his hands steady but cautious as he continued to monitor the fragile life resting within the folds of his jacket, while Ranger sat a few feet away, posture firm yet no longer rigid, as though the urgency had transformed into something more patient, more deliberate. The puppy's breathing remained uneven, but it no longer disappeared into silence between intervals. instead holding on just long enough to be noticed, as if each breath had become an argument against the fading world around it. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his focus narrowing to the smallest details, the subtle rise of the chest, the faint twitch of movement beneath the fabric, the way life sometimes chooses to speak in signals too small for certainty but too persistent to ignore. Ranger shifted his gaze between Ethan and the puppy, never breaking focus, as though he understood that attention itself had become part of the intervention. A distant break in the clouds allowed a muted shaft of light to filter through the canopy, scattering weak illumination across the forest floor, and for the first time, the environment felt less like a witness to struggle and more like a participant in restraint. Ethan reached slowly toward his radio again, this time activating it with a brief press, his voice calm, but measured as he requested medical support at his current coordinates. His words clipped yet steady, shaped by training that had taught him to separate emotion from necessity. After transmitting the location, he returned the device to his vest and refocused entirely on the small life in front of him, adjusting the jacket slightly to preserve warmth as the wind shifted direction and carried a cooler draft through the trees. Ranger stood again, taking a step closer, then another, until he was positioned beside Ethan, not interfering, but aligning himself with the space where effort was being concentrated, as if forming a silent perimeter around the fragile moment. Ethan glanced at him briefly, noting the steadiness in the dog's stance, the way his presence did not waver even when uncertainty filled every gap in the situation. "You are not leaving this spot," Ethan said quietly, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement of what was already happening between them. The puppy responded with a faint movement, a slight tightening beneath the fabric, barely enough to register as change, but enough for Ethan to pause and observe more carefully, realizing that the rhythm of survival had shifted from fading to fluctuating, a pattern that suggested resistance rather than surrender. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle deeper, not as pressure, but as responsibility that could not be transferred. Ranger lowered his head again, this time resting it closer to the edge of the jacket, his presence reducing the distance between instinct and comfort, as if offering a silent reassurance that did not require interpretation. The forest around them remained unchanged in appearance, yet the meaning of its silence had altered, no longer indifferent but observant in a way that felt almost intentional, as if nature itself was holding back its next decision. Ethan adjusted his position slightly, sitting back on his heels, maintaining contact through proximity rather than force, aware that too much movement might disrupt the delicate balance that had formed. Minutes passed in a steady rhythm of waiting, not passive but attentive, where every small sound carried significance and every pause demanded patience. The puppy's breathing remained unstable, yet it persisted, and in that persistence Ethan found something he could not ignore, a reminder that survival is often less about strength and more about refusing to disappear completely. Ranger finally settled fully beside him, no longer scanning the surroundings with urgency, but remaining alert in a quieter form, as though accepting that the immediate threat was not external but internal, measured in breath and time. Ethan watched both of them for a long moment, understanding without needing to articulate that what had begun here was no longer just intervention, but continuity, a fragile extension of will shared across species, held together not by certainty, but by presence alone. The forest had settled into a strange kind of stillness, the kind that follows emotional weight rather than weather, as if even the wind had learned to move more carefully around what was unfolding on the ground beneath the trees. Sergeant Ethan Miller remained in place beside the fallen log, his posture steady, his attention locked on the small bundle wrapped in his jacket, where fragile life continued to resist fading into silence. Ranger stood close now, not pacing, not scanning, but simply present, his body angled toward Ethan and the puppy as though the boundary between protection and participation had quietly disappeared. The radio Ethan had activated earlier now remained silent, no further updates breaking through the forest, leaving only the distant hum of wind through pine needles and the soft, irregular rhythm of breathing that still clung stubbornly to the moment. Ethan adjusted his position slightly, shifting weight from one knee to the other, careful not to disturb the fragile stability he had been maintaining. The puppy inside the jacket gave a faint movement, small enough that it could have been mistaken for instinct rather than intention, yet it was enough to hold Ethan's attention sharper than before. He leaned in slightly, watching the rise and fall with renewed focus, noting that while the pattern remained weak, it had begun to stabilize in intervals that were no longer purely random. Ranger lowered his head again, resting closer to the edge of the jacket, his presence now almost protective in a quiet, anchored way, as though he had decided that this was no longer a moment to guard against danger, but a moment to guard against loss itself. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly to the surrounding forest, scanning out of habit rather than concern, then returning immediately to the task in front of him. Time felt slower now, stretched by attention and uncertainty, each second carrying more weight than it should have in an environment that otherwise remained unchanged. The damp earth beneath them held the scent of rain and pine, grounding everything in a reality that was still indifferent to their effort, yet somehow less distant than before. Ethan gently adjusted the jacket again, creating a more stable pocket of warmth, careful not to introduce pressure, only preservation, his movements precise in a way that came from training shaped by repetition rather than emotion. Ranger shifted slightly, then sat fully, his gaze never leaving the puppy, as if acknowledging that stillness had become part of the solution rather than a lack of action. A faint sound broke the silence, so subtle it could have been mistaken for the forest itself, but Ethan immediately focused, leaning closer, confirming that the movement came from within the jacket rather than outside it. The puppy's breathing changed again, not dramatically, but enough to suggest a shift in rhythm, a pattern that no longer seemed entirely fragile, as if something within had begun to respond to the environment rather than retreat from it. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but something in his focus sharpened, the way it does when uncertainty begins to tilt toward possibility. Ranger responded by lowering his head even further, almost touching the fabric, as though reinforcing the boundary between chaos and calm through presence alone. Ethan spoke softly again, not as command, but as reassurance meant for no audience other than the fragile life in his hands, his voice low enough to blend with the wind. The forest remained unchanged in appearance, yet its silence now felt less absolute, as if it were allowing space for something to continue rather than end. Minutes passed without interruption, each one measured not by clocks or movement, but by the persistence of breath, and in that persistence Ethan found a form of confirmation that did not require explanation. He sat back slightly, maintaining contact through proximity rather than intervention, understanding that sometimes the most critical role is simply to remain where you are until change either arrives or disappears. Ranger finally relaxed his shoulders just enough to signal acceptance of the moment's direction, though his attention never wavered, still fixed on the small life that had become the center of everything within reach. Ethan looked between Ranger and the jacket once more, realizing that what had begun as a chance encounter in a remote stretch of forest had now settled into something neither accidental nor fully understood, but undeniably real in its quiet insistence to continue. The forest had begun to feel different in the way silence changes when it is no longer empty, but full of meaning, as if every sound now carried a purpose instead of simply existing, and Sergeant Ethan Miller could feel that shift in the way even his own breathing seemed more measured than before. He remained seated beside the fallen log, his hands steady beneath the jacket that sheltered the fragile life within, while Ranger stayed close in a posture that was no longer rigid with alertness, but grounded in quiet persistence, as though he had accepted that nothing else mattered more in this moment than what was happening right here on the wet forest floor. The radio on Ethan's vest remained silent, but the absence of communication no longer felt like isolation, only space, as if the world beyond the trees had temporarily stepped back to allow something small but important to continue. The puppy inside the jacket shifted faintly, a movement so subtle it might have been mistaken for imagination, yet Ethan immediately noticed it, his attention narrowing with instinct sharpened by experience. He adjusted the jacket carefully once more, ensuring that warmth remained contained, his movements slow and deliberate, shaped not by urgency, but by the understanding that fragile conditions could not tolerate disruption. Ranger leaned in slightly, his nose hovering near the edge of the fabric, not touching, but close enough that his presence alone seemed to create a boundary between stillness and uncertainty. The forest around them remained unchanged in appearance, yet the atmosphere had taken on a heavier focus, as if even the wind had slowed to observe. Ethan's gaze remained fixed, tracking the smallest changes, and for a moment he thought he noticed a more consistent rhythm beneath the jacket, a pattern that suggested the fragile life was still fighting to remain present rather than slipping away. He did not speak, because speaking too much in moments like this often breaks the delicate balance that survival depends on. Ranger shifted his weight slightly, settling into a position that placed him between Ethan and the surrounding trees, not as a barrier against threat, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the space they occupied had become singular, separate from everything else. Minutes passed in a steady quiet that felt almost suspended, where time no longer moved forward in a clear line, but instead lingered around each breath and each pause. Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease slightly, not into relief, but into cautious patience, the kind that only appears when uncertainty begins to show patterns instead of randomness. Then, without warning, the subtle rhythm beneath the jacket faltered, a change so small that it might have gone unnoticed under different circumstances, but Ethan immediately sensed it, his attention sharpening as he leaned closer. The puppy's breathing became irregular again, not absent, but unstable, as if the fragile balance had been disturbed from within. Ranger responded instantly, lifting his head, eyes fixed, posture tightening just enough to signal that he had sensed the same change. Ethan did not move abruptly, but his hands adjusted the jacket with careful precision, maintaining warmth while monitoring the condition beneath it, his focus absolute. The forest seemed to quiet further, as if even the surrounding environment recognized the shift in stability. Ethan spoke softly, not in command, but in steady reassurance, his voice low and controlled, intended more as presence than instruction. Ranger remained still, but alertness returned to his frame, not panic, but readiness, the kind that waits without interfering. For a few long moments, nothing changed, and that absence of change carried its own weight, stretching the tension between hope and uncertainty until it became almost tangible. Then, faintly, the rhythm returned, weaker than before but undeniably present, a fragile reassertion of continuity that drew Ethan's attention immediately back to focus. He exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement of persistence, the recognition that life often does not recover in a straight line, but instead returns in uneven steps. Ranger lowered his head again, this time resting it near the edge of the jacket with a calmness that suggested acceptance rather than vigilance. Ethan remained still, allowing the moment to stabilize on its own, understanding that intervention beyond what had already been done might do more harm than good. The forest maintained its quiet rhythm, rain no longer falling, but moisture still clinging to every surface, reflecting faint light that filtered through thinning clouds. In that softened environment, the fragile life beneath the jacket continued to hold on, not strongly, not confidently, but consistently enough to change the meaning of the silence around it. Ethan finally leaned back slightly, maintaining his position but easing the pressure of constant adjustment, his eyes still fixed on the subtle rise and fall that had become the only measure of time that mattered. Ranger remained beside him, unwavering, as if the boundary between duty and presence had dissolved into something simpler, something that required no instruction to understand. And within that small, enclosed space of damp earth, filtered light, and shared attention, the difference between fading and continuing remained uncertain, but no longer invisible, held together now by nothing more than patience, warmth, and the quiet refusal to let go. The forest had begun to change in a way that was not visible to the eye, but undeniable to anyone who had been paying attention long enough, as if the stillness itself had shifted from uncertainty into fragile continuity, and Sergeant Ethan Miller could feel it in the way his focus no longer needed to chase every irregular detail, but instead followed a pattern that was slowly, carefully trying to hold itself together. He remained seated beside the fallen log, his hands steady beneath the jacket that contained the small life he had been monitoring for what felt like both minutes and hours at the same time. while Ranger stayed in position close enough that their presence overlapped in a shared sense of quiet responsibility. The forest around them no longer felt like an indifferent backdrop, but like a space that had narrowed its attention, the wind softer now, moving through branches with less urgency, and even the distant drip of water falling from leaves seemed more measured than before. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the subtle movement beneath the fabric, noticing that the rhythm he had been tracking earlier was no longer fluctuating in the same unpredictable way but had begun to stabilize and faint, uneven intervals that suggested persistence rather than decline. He did not speak, because speaking would have introduced unnecessary disruption into a system that was already balancing on the edge of restoration. Ranger shifted slightly, adjusting his posture without breaking his focus, his presence steady and grounded as though he had become an extension of the space itself, no longer reacting but maintaining. Ethan carefully adjusted the jacket once more, not to intervene, but to preserve what had already begun to take shape, his movements slow and precise, shaped by discipline that had learned the value of restraint in critical moments. For a long stretch of time, nothing changed in any dramatic way, yet the absence of decline itself became meaningful, a subtle confirmation that the situation was no longer collapsing inward but instead holding its position against uncertainty. Then, very faintly, Ethan noticed a shift in the rhythm beneath his hands, a pattern that was no longer purely erratic but instead carried a thin, uneven consistency that suggested effort rather than surrender. He leaned forward slightly, narrowing his attention, his entire awareness focused on that fragile signal, as Ranger also lifted his head in response, mirroring the change without hesitation. The forest seemed to grow even quieter in response, as though acknowledging the importance of what was happening within this small, contained space. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but his focus sharpened further, tracking each subtle change as it unfolded, recognizing that survival in moments like this rarely announces itself clearly, but instead reveals itself in fragments that must be assembled through patience. The puppy's condition did not improve in any dramatic surge, but it also did not recede, and that balance alone carried weight, enough to alter the way Ethan interpreted every second that passed. Ranger stepped slightly closer again, his nose near the edge of the jacket, then paused, remaining still, as if confirming the stability through proximity rather than action. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath controlled and deliberate, his hands maintaining their position as he continued to provide warmth and consistency, understanding that at this stage, interruption mattered more than effort. A faint sound from deeper within the forest reached them, distant and natural, but it no longer drew Ethan's attention away from what lay in front of him, because the center of focus had already been established and nothing external seemed capable of shifting it. The rhythm beneath the jacket continued in uneven but present intervals, and Ethan began to recognize that what he was observing was no longer simply a struggle against fading, but something closer to stabilization under conditions that were still far from secure. Ranger finally settled into a fully seated position again, not withdrawing but grounding himself beside Ethan, their shared attention forming a silent structure around the fragile life between them. Minutes continued to pass, unmarked and uninterrupted, and within that passage Ethan found a quiet acknowledgement forming in his mind that progress in situations like this is rarely visible in dramatic turns but instead exists in the refusal of collapse. He remained still, allowing the moment to sustain itself without interference, aware that every small consistency mattered more than any immediate change. The forest, still dampened, softened by lingering moisture, seemed to hold its distance in a respectful silence, as if even nature itself had adjusted its presence to match the fragility of what was unfolding below the trees. And within that narrow space of shared attention, warmth, and persistence, the boundary between uncertainty and continuation remained delicate, but no longer shifting toward loss, instead resting in a fragile equilibrium that suggested something quietly determined to remain. The forest no longer felt like a place waiting for something to end, but instead like a place quietly learning how to hold on, as if even the air itself had adjusted to the fragile continuity forming beneath the trees. Sergeant Ethan Miller remained seated beside the fallen log, his hands still steady beneath the jacket that sheltered the small life he had been guarding through the long stretch of uncertain minutes, while Ranger stayed close at his side in a posture that was no longer tense with alertness, but deeply anchored in quiet presence. The damp earth beneath them carried the scent of rain and pine, softened now by time and stillness, and the wind that moved through the branches above seemed less intrusive, as though it had lost its urgency and chosen instead to observe. Ethan's focus remained absolute, his eyes tracking the faint, uneven rhythm beneath the fabric, a pattern that had shifted away from instability into something that suggested persistence rather than decline. He did not move unnecessarily, because every motion had become intentional, shaped by the understanding that fragile balance could be disrupted by even the smallest disturbance. Ranger lowered his head slightly, remaining close enough that his presence created a steady boundary around the space they occupied, not as protection against threat, but as reinforcement of continuity. Ethan adjusted the jacket with the same controlled precision he had maintained throughout, ensuring warmth remained consistent, his movements deliberate and measured, as if time itself had become something that required careful handling. For several long moments, nothing changed in any visible or dramatic way, yet the absence of deterioration itself became a signal, subtle but meaningful, that the fragile system they were observing was no longer slipping backward. Then, faintly at first, Ethan noticed a shift that was different from before, a slight strengthening in the irregular rhythm beneath his hands, not stable enough to be called recovery, but no longer random enough to be dismissed as uncertainty. He leaned forward slightly, narrowing his attention further, while Ranger responded immediately, lifting his head and focusing with renewed intensity, mirroring the change without hesitation. The forest seemed to recede even further in that moment, its sounds fading into the background until only the immediate space between them remained relevant, as though the world beyond the trees had temporarily agreed to remain silent. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath controlled and steady, recognizing that what he was witnessing was not resolution but resistance gaining structure, a fragile reorganization of something that had nearly disappeared. He kept his hands steady beneath the jacket, maintaining warmth without pressure, aware that stability at this stage depended more on consistency than intervention. Ranger shifted slightly closer again, not pressing forward, but aligning himself so that his presence matched Ethan's position exactly, as if reinforcing a shared understanding without the need for command. Minutes passed in this suspended state, unmarked by urgency, yet filled with a depth of attention that made each second feel significant. Ethan's eyes remained fixed, tracking every subtle change, noticing how the rhythm no longer collapsed into silence, but continued in uneven persistence, like something learning how to sustain itself under difficult conditions. The forest, still damp and softened by lingering moisture, seemed less distant now, its silence no longer indifferent but measured, as though it had adapted to the fragile continuity unfolding within it. Ethan adjusted his posture slightly, maintaining contact through careful presence rather than action, his focus unwavering, while Ranger remained steady beside him, no longer scanning outward but fully committed to the small circle of life and attention they were sustaining together. The puppy beneath the jacket gave another faint shift, not large enough to change the situation dramatically, but enough to confirm that the fragile rhythm was still present and continuing forward in uneven but persistent intervals. Ethan did not react outwardly, but internally he registered the significance of that continuity, understanding that survival in moments like this often reveals itself not in recovery, but in refusal to disappear. Ranger lowered his head once more, settling into stillness that mirrored Ethan's controlled patience, and together they maintained the space around the fragile life without interruption. The forest remained unchanged in appearance, yet the meaning of its silence had evolved again, becoming something that felt less like absence and more like quiet acknowledgement. And within that narrow space of warmth, breath, and unwavering attention, the fragile boundary between uncertainty and continuation held steady, no longer drifting toward loss, but resting in a delicate state of persistence that neither demanded celebration nor allowed release. The forest had settled into a silence that no longer felt uncertain, but instead carried a strange sense of completion, as if something fragile had passed through its most dangerous threshold and was now simply learning how to exist within the space it had almost lost. Sergeant Ethan Miller remained seated beside the fallen log, his hands still steady beneath the jacket that held the small life he had been protecting through hours that no longer felt measurable in ordinary time, while Ranger stayed close in a calm, grounded posture that reflected a shift from vigilance into quiet assurance. The damp air around them carried a softened scent of pine and earth, and the faint movement of wind through the trees no longer felt like interruption, but like distant acknowledgement. Ethan's focus remained locked on the subtle rhythm beneath the fabric, and now that rhythm had changed in a way that was no longer uncertain. It was still weak, still fragile, but it carried a continuity that had not been present before, a steady persistence that suggested not survival in theory, but survival in process. He did not move quickly or speak, because the moment demanded restraint rather than reaction, and he had learned through experience that fragile recovery could be undone by urgency. Ranger remained still beside him, his head slightly lowered, eyes fixed forward, not scanning for threat anymore, but simply maintaining presence, as if understanding that the danger they were guarding against was no longer external. Ethan carefully adjusted the jacket once more, ensuring that warmth remained consistent, his movements precise and controlled, shaped by the understanding that stability was built through patience rather than force. For a long stretch of time, nothing changed outwardly, yet everything about the moment had shifted inwardly, as though the entire forest had quietly acknowledged that the boundary between loss and continuation had been crossed and not broken. Then, slowly, the rhythm beneath the fabric strengthened again, not dramatically, but enough to remove doubt from Ethan's attention. He leaned slightly forward, narrowing his focus, while Ranger responded by lifting his head fully, posture firm once more, as if confirming the change through shared awareness. The forest around them remained unchanged in appearance, but the atmosphere felt different now, less like waiting and more like witnessing, as though time itself had shifted its purpose from observation to allowance. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recognition, understanding that what he was seeing was no longer instability struggling against collapse, but life re-establishing its own uneven structure. He maintained his position, keeping contact steady through warmth and proximity, his hands never leaving the jacket, because even positive change required consistency to hold its shape. Ranger adjusted slightly closer again, not intruding, but aligning himself in a way that mirrored Ethan's stillness, forming a quiet symmetry around the fragile life between them. The puppy beneath the jacket shifted faintly, a movement that was no longer uncertain but present, followed by a breath that held slightly longer than before, and in that small extension of time, Ethan recognized something unmistakable. It was not recovery in a complete sense, but it was continuation with direction, a pattern that no longer drifted toward absence. He remained silent, allowing the moment to stabilize without interference, his awareness fully anchored in the subtle signs that defined this stage of survival. Ranger stayed motionless, his presence no longer urgent but steady, as though accepting that what had been uncertain was now simply in transition. The forest, still damp and quiet, seemed to hold itself differently, as if even its silence had adjusted to accommodate what was now happening within its boundaries. Ethan's attention did not waver, but it softened slightly, not into distraction, but into acceptance that the fragile system he had been monitoring was no longer breaking down. Minutes passed in this controlled stillness, where every breath mattered not because it was dramatic, but because it continued. And within that continuation, beneath the filtered light and softened wind, the fragile boundary that had once hovered between fading and remaining finally leaned, however slightly, toward persistence. The forest had entered a state of quiet resolution, not because anything had ended, but because something fragile had finally found a way to continue without collapsing, and Sergeant Ethan Miller could feel that truth in the way the moment no longer demanded constant correction or control. He remained seated beside the fallen log, his hands still carefully positioned beneath the jacket that held the small life he had been protecting through the long, uncertain passage of time, while Ranger stood nearby in a calm and grounded posture that no longer carried urgency, only steady presence. The air around them felt lighter than before, as if the forest itself had exhaled in response to what had taken place within it, and the distant movement of wind through branches now sounded less like observation and more like acceptance. Ethan's focus remained on the subtle rhythm beneath the fabric, and now that rhythm had stabilized into something unmistakably consistent, still weak, still delicate, but no longer drifting toward disappearance. He did not move unnecessarily, because he understood that stability at this stage was not something to be celebrated loudly, but something to be protected quietly. Ranger lowered his head slightly, remaining close, his posture reflecting a settled awareness that no immediate danger remained, only the responsibility of continuity. Ethan carefully adjusted the jacket one final time, ensuring warmth remained constant, his movements slow and precise, shaped by discipline and patience rather than urgency. For several moments, nothing changed in any visible way, yet everything within the space had shifted in meaning, as if the fragile line between uncertainty and continuation had been crossed and was now holding its position. Then, the rhythm beneath the fabric strengthened again, not abruptly, but in a steady and undeniable progression that removed any remaining doubt. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing, while Ranger responded by lifting his head fully, posture aligned and steady, as though acknowledging the change without needing confirmation. The forest around them remained unchanged in form, but its silence now felt different, less like suspension and more like witness, as if it had adjusted itself to accommodate what was no longer fading. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recognition, understanding that what he was observing had moved beyond crisis into fragile persistence. He maintained contact through warmth and stillness, his hands never leaving their position, because consistency now mattered more than intervention. Ranger remained beside him, no longer shifting or scanning, but fully present, as if the need for protection had transformed into the need for shared stability. The puppy beneath the jacket moved faintly, a small but intentional motion that suggested awareness returning in uneven fragments, followed by a breath that held longer than before, and in that simple extension Ethan recognized something definitive had changed. It was no longer a question of whether the moment would collapse, but whether it could continue in this fragile state long enough to strengthen further. He stayed still, allowing the process to unfold. Without interruption, his focus absolute yet calm, shaped by an understanding that survival often reveals itself in increments too small for certainty but too consistent for doubt. Ranger shifted slightly closer once more, then settled again, his presence now fully aligned with Ethan's, forming a quiet balance around the space where life continued to persist. The forest, still damp and muted by lingering moisture, seemed to hold itself in a softer configuration, as if acknowledging that something within its boundaries had shifted from uncertainty into fragile endurance. Ethan's gaze remained fixed, but his posture eased slightly, not into distraction, but into acceptance that the moment no longer required defense, only maintenance. And within that narrow space of breath, warmth, and shared attention, the fragile boundary that had once hovered between disappearance and continuation now rested firmly on the side of remaining.